Should be live now. I'm not super sure. We had a lot of technical difficulties last time, so I'm going on live about like a minute early to do some quick testing. So if you're in the comment section, if you joined already, say hi, say something so I know that things are working. I guess things are not working. You know, I really do not like LinkedIn live events because you never know what's working and what's not working because everything's so delayed. So I'm assuming nothing's working until I see comments. Oh no, it's working. I have no idea if anybody is actually in here because I didn't do many invitations for this event. So I'm going to do a little bit of testing and play the video. Let's see if this works. All right. No, I know I'm live. I know I'm live now, but I'm not super sure if the video is going to play sound. And there's no sound. Wonderful. All right, so we have our first technical difficulty again. So let me try this again. Sorry for this, but we'll get it up soon and running. Extra camera, share screen. You know, if I were more professional, I would have done this beforehand instead of doing this live, but that's just kind of where I am these days.
Here, this video is going to be a quick walkthrough so you can get a sense for where everything's at and learn how to Figma file.
This should work. I hope this works. All right, if you can hear the sound. Yeah, it's live again. All right, be right back. All right, so now that there's sound, okay, we can finally begin. So, super unprofessional of me. Sorry, I'm so sorry for this, but now everything's working. So a little bit about me. I've been a design recruiter for about 2 years now, so I have not had to do any serious design in Figma in about 2 years. So I'm very rusty. When Figma released their new UI, I was very confused. I was like, this, I'm not familiar with it at all. I had last built my design system about more than 2 years ago, almost 3 years ago now. So at that point, I was pretty good with Figma, but I wouldn't say I was like top 1% in any way whatsoever. So I was fairly excited when I saw Rit's course called Figma Academy 2.0 available for sale at one point. And it's still on sale for now. At $500, you get both Tommy Gioco's course on making design decisions or UX decisions, and then you also get Figma Academy 2.0. So this is the other half of it, and I am super excited. My assumption going to this course is that this is for senior level designers who are okay at Figma, who have some experience, but might struggle with more advanced functionalities like variables. That's kind of new, and also maybe with auto layout. So I don't know if this will be super helpful if you're looking for a design job right now, but if you're a currently working designer and you want to become more efficient, trying to build higher quality components, really get the most out of Figma, then this would be the course for you to watch. Even at its full price, around $400 or $500, just for the course alone, I think that's worth it if it can just save me 10 hours of time in the next few weeks by becoming more efficient. So let's start with the course. He has an introduction video, and let's start with that. So if you're having any issues with sounds, let me know. That's been an on and off issue with Chrome and Firefox. I've struggled to fix for some reason. So let's give it a try.
Welcome to Figma Academy. My name is Rid, and I'm so glad that you're here. This video is going to be a quick walkthrough so you can get a sense for where everything's at and learn how the Figma files work. You've obviously found the guidebook file, which is a great start. What I recommend you doing is duplicating this file, because What I've built is a nice little lesson list that you can use to track your progress. And these are all built as components. So once you finish a lesson, all you have to do is mark this component property as complete. And that way you can build out a nice little visual representation of where you're at in the course. Each one of these are hyperlinks that'll take you to that relevant file. And then the last thing to know about your guidebook is I have a little prerequisites page right here that's gonna list out all of the different techniques and features that'll be nice to be familiar with before diving too deep into the program. This curriculum isn't always a walkthrough of how the basic features work. Most of the time is spent building on top of those foundations so we can really get into more advanced techniques. So if anything on this list looks new to you, I definitely recommend taking a few minutes at least to familiarize yourself with the feature set. Zooming out, there are two main projects.
All right, I've seen problems already because I see variants and auto layout as advanced features, so I am way out of depth here. Maybe I have to look into it real quick before I get into this tutorial, but we don't have the time for that, so let's just dive right back in and assume that most people already know how to use auto layouts and variants. I used to know how to use auto layout. I am probably pretty shaky at this point. And then for variants, I have no idea. I've been hearing about it, but again, I haven't used Figma for real in a long time before variants even came out. So I have some assumptions, but I don't know for sure what it is yet.
Zooming out, there are two main projects in this Figma team. The first is called Academy 2.0 Lessons, and this is where you're going to find all of the individual video lessons, slides, resources, things like that. And the other is the demo project. As I'm building out these lessons, I'm also creating a lot of UI that I can use to teach from, and I think it's going to be a really valuable resource for you as well, so I recommend you duplicating these files and then you can kind of break them apart and see how I built things. Once you hop into an individual module file, you'll see a list of all of the lessons as pages over here, and for that first frame in each lesson, there's going to be an embedded video that you can access by simply clicking this link just like so, and that will open up the video for you to watch. While I'm going through the video lesson, you can just tap N and follow along with all of the slides automatically. And then at the end, a lot of the lessons have bonus resources in case you want to go a little bit deeper into the topic. Feel free to bounce around and go at your own pace. If at any point you're going through the course and you realize you want a little bit more accountability, or maybe you just want to be a part of the community or join the weekly live sessions, then you can come right here and use this link to access the training program at $500 off. That's all for now. Once again, I'm so excited to have you here. I've seen the impact that this curriculum has had on designers all over the world, so I hope that this helps you take that next step in your career.
All right, wow, I'm impressed. I'm pretty impressed right now because he does certain things very well. Like we haven't even gotten into Figma yet, but he's smart in that the way he packaged this course together starts from the Figma files itself, and then you get into the videos. And that's kind of the opposite of what Tommy did last week, which was to do the videos first, and then you do the add-on homework at the end. And I think this one reversed it because I think Rit knows that people typically want to jump into the videos right away before they jump into the actual coursework. So this reversed it, forces you to go into coursework first. There's seems to be a lot of prep work involved as well. So it's very well designed. Like I'm excited for this so far. So I'm gonna go to the next one. So this is an issue with showing video. Like I want to show you I have to go to a different tab in order to go to the next video. But if I try to show the entire browser window, you don't get sound from the video, which is kind of a pain in the ass. So give me 1 second. So the next link that Rit wants me to go to is this page. Figma for education. Why do I need to do this? So he says sign up for an education plan. This will give you free access to all Figma's premium features. It's auto approval. You can upgrade your private account like this. So, okay, that's clever. I didn't know about that. I did not know that at all. All right. And then after you get approval, so by the way, so if if you're not paying for Figma right now and you want to get access to their premium features, then apparently you can get verified through the educational plan, auto approval, and you can get that without having to pay anything. So that's really clever. Wish I knew about that. The next link he tells us to go to is the Figma file itself for this module. So it's getting started in Figma, and there's some comments already. I do have layers just below pages like in your screenshot materials, blah, blah, blah. Okay, cool. Playground files, bonus resources, getting started in variables. So I'm going to start the video, which goes to a different page. So I have to bring it back to this tab so you can all see it and hear it, which now doesn't work anymore. Huh. All right.
Before we get into the
All right, you should be able to see that, right? Cool. This is so hacky, but that's just how Chrome works these days.
strategy and all of the meaty decisions that go into building a system with variables, I want to get a little bit of momentum and just start building so that we can see what variables make possible in Figma. Let's dive in. I went ahead and created a little test environment that we can use to start experimenting. It's pretty simple. I just have a body of content here on the right. There's a list of pages here on the left with a page item component. And then lastly, we have our page nav component here above. And the first thing I want to demo is how to set up some basic theming using variables. Now, I'm not going to go through the entire process of setting up a full dark mode system from scratch, but if we set up a little high contrast mode, you can start to see what's possible. And what I'm going to need to do is set up some basic theming on this page background and then everything in this header component. Right now, this is everyone's favorite FA. And so if I go into local variables, it's going to default me to collection 1. I'm going to go ahead and rename this and call it colors. And I want to create a page background variable. But before I go any further, a quick note, try not to put too much weight into how I'm naming things, because the whole purpose of this exercise is to kind of just start experimenting without the constraints of a larger system. There's a lot of thought that goes into creating a nice semantic color system, but we're going to cover that in a few lessons. For now, I'm going to create this color variable. Let's call this background page. And we already know this is the default. What I need to do is create a second mode, and I'm going to call this high contrast, and this can go ahead and be default. Now I already have a hex code on my clipboard, so I'm going to go ahead and just paste that in there like so. And now that I have that defined, I can go ahead and change my fill and reference this background page. Now, as soon as I do that, this variables icon is going to appear in your layer box. And if you click that, you'll see this colors collection that we just created, and it's going to be set to auto, which is always going to be that first mode that shows up. Now, if I want to run a quick test, I can change this to high contrast, and right away you'll see the background changes. So let's go ahead and spin up the rest of these colors. We can start with the course name and logo next. So if I come in here, I can grab these two colors. You'll have to click on the canvas to deselect everything, which is going to open up that local variables again and say something like logo strong. And then the easiest way to create a new variable is to hit Shift Enter, and that's going to just duplicate it below. And I'm going to go ahead and call this one logo subtle. So in the light mode, I have this on my clipboard. I'm going to go to my clipboard history and grab this guy, put it in the logo strong. And now I just have to invert this for the high contrast. And you're typically going to think about this as color pairs. So in the same way that I'm switching between these two colors here, I'll probably do something similar for my strong. And then for the subtle, let's just keep it the same to see how it looks, because we don't always need to make a change across modes. Now let's just come here and quickly apply our new variables in the same way that we would with styles. And then if we select all of this and run a quick test, pretty cool, huh? Now in the last step, let's come up here and knock out our page nav button. If we drill into all of our variants, we can see what we're dealing with in all of the selection colors. Let's refer to this as our brand color. And then from there, we have the same three colors that we're dealing with. So if we open up our local variables here, I think we're going to have something called brand. And for simplicity, let's just make that the same in both modes. Now, if we move up here, we have a similar pattern that we used for the logo. So we could go ahead and create totally new color variables. Maybe we would call this something like page nav strong, for instance. And that could totally be fine, but We could also consolidate these. So if I rename this from logo to text, all of a sudden, maybe we can knock out some of these redundancies. So let's just see what happens when I apply these. If I make this text strong, we'll make this brand, text subtle. And then to keep things simple, let's just make our white this background page. So if we run a quick test again and come in here and get into high contrast, just like that, everything changes like magic. And we can go ahead and come in here and make any subtle adjustments that we want. Like maybe we want this to be a little bit brighter in high contrast mode, and we can see that change automatically reflect below. Now, another really powerful thing that you can do with variables is use the number variable to introduce some sizing logic. If we drill into this component here, you'll see I'm using 16 pixels for the vertical padding, which is just a raw number. It's not actually using a variable. So let's change that and see what we can do. So if I deselect everything, go into local variables, I definitely don't want to add this in my colors collection. So I'm going to hit this dropdown, create a new collection, and we can call this spacing. Now I can go ahead and create my first variable. We want to select a number, and I'll just call this default for now. And let's set this to 16 pixels because that's what I currently have. But I want to test out different spacing modes. So if I add a new mode over here, maybe I'll call this one loose and this one compact. And in loose, I could change the 16 to an 8. And by default, I can use these values anywhere. So what I might want to do is hit this edit variable, and then you can change where designers will be able to use these values. So I probably don't want it anywhere. So by default, I'm going to unselect everything, and let's just surface it within the auto layout gap. Now, once I do that, I can exit out. Let's come back to our page item. Now that I hover over this input, you'll see this variable icon now exists. So if I click on this, I can set the spacing to default. When I select this panel, now this variable modes icon is available at the layer level. I can click on it, go into spacing. It's automatically set to loose since that's the first mode that I created, but I can come in here and change it to compact, and it's automatically going to change the vertical padding for all of my nested instances. And this example is just dealing with page density. Imagine all of the other modes that we're going to be creating with number variables. Now for one final example, let's take a look at what is possible with string variables. Right now, all of these labels are one-off values, but what if I want to localize this text? Well, what I can do is head into my local variables. Let's create a new collection. We'll call this language. And I'm going to quickly spin up some string variables here. So let's give these a generic name like page 1, page 2, page 3, and page 4. And then I'm just going to go ahead and match the English values to start. But then what you can do from here is create a new mode. And I'm actually going to make this Chinese and this English. Now, hopefully Google Translate did not let me down, but let's see how this works in practice. Now, the first thing I have to do is bind these variables to the specific text elements in Figma. So if I select all of these labels here, now you'll see this apply variable icon is present in the text box. So if I click on this, I can turn them all into page 1, which is going to immediately override everything down here. And I'll come in and just connect page 2, page 3, and finally page 4. So now that we have that done, that's going to bring this collection into any layer list that I select. And that could be at the page level, it could be at the entire mockup level, or just the header level, depending on how I want to use it. So if I select language and change it to Chinese, everything will automatically reflect just like that. We're going to cover a lot more use cases for variables throughout the lessons, but hopefully this gives you a little taste before we start getting into the strategy of building your system in Figma.
Okay, wow, that was great. That's pretty. That kind of blew my mind a little bit. Okay, so I don't have any understanding of variables at all at this point, and he just jumped directly into use cases where variables could be extremely powerful. My understanding of this so far is it's like styles in Figma. Like that's the last feature that I used for design systems about 2 years ago before variables came about. And it's basically scaling that up onto a whole different level. So this makes sense. I probably need to spend a little bit more time learning about variables first before I get the real value out of that video, but it kind of shows me what the possibilities are, which is great. So I'm going to try to jump into the next video at this point. And it's not really clear where I can find the next video. Huh. I guess I am not very bright. But yeah, that blew my mind. I like that. It's showing me how powerful Figma can be, but it also makes me wonder, like, why are we using Figma at this point if we're going to get into variables? Like, we might as well just learn how to code. Click the text link to watch the course videos. I guess the next... So, Chrome disabled ad block, and I'm never going to pay for YouTube Red.
From heated debates to awkward silences.
So now I have to watch Joe Rogan ads? Fuck me. Oh, are you fucking serious? I can't do this. Oh, fuck. This is painful. I don't want to see Candace Owens' face. I don't want to see her mug. I'm trying to learn Figma, not get angry. Oh, maybe this is not an ad. This is just the next video. Like, I thought if I played the next, right, fast forward, it would go to the next video, but it doesn't. Lesson list. Okay, I think I have it now. How to create a brand palette on easy mode. Okay, so I have to click around the Figma file. Because I'm an idiot. So that's funny. That's what YouTube suggested for me, a Joe Rogan episode next. Because I'm a huge Joe Rogan fan, apparently. It's like they're trying to radicalize me or something. Anyway, so this will be the next lesson, creating a brand palette on easy mode. And here is the video for it. So, by the way, I did ask Rid for permission to show these videos ahead of time. And I think our agreement is that I wouldn't show all the videos, obviously, because then there would be no reason for people to purchase his. Well, there's still a lot of reasons to purchase it, right? Because the other materials, the supporting materials in the Figma files are extremely valuable from what I've seen so far. But I think the agreement is that I wouldn't show all the videos. I would show like a good percentage of it so that we all can get a pretty good sense of the quality of it.
There's a reason if you go to
decision.
design school that they're going to spend months on color theory. It's tricky, it's nuanced, and this is not a masterclass on everything color. Instead, this lesson looks at the science of building a color palette. Because when you boil it down to what you actually need as a product designer, you realize that it's a bit more systematic and predictable than you thought. Let's dive in. Now, in order to walk you through the process of creating a brand palette from scratch, we have to stop using hex codes. Instead, I highly recommend using HSB or HSL. There are pros and cons to each, but for the sake of this lesson, I'm going to use HSB. And if you're not familiar, all HSB means is hue, saturation, and brightness. And it gives us 3 numbers that we can use to dictate color. And what this does is it introduces a math component to building a color system that makes it very systematic. Now you might notice these 3 colors. These are the 3 primary colors of Figma Academy. And what I want to draw your attention to is a couple of rules of thumb that I have for building a cohesive palette. And that is that we want to standardize the saturation and brightness values as much as possible. Now these don't have to be the exact same number, but my general rule of thumb is if we keep them within 10, we can guarantee that this is going to be a cohesive palette. So if you look at these numbers, for my brightness, I have 99, 94, and 91, saturation 45, 54, and 52. And when you have this kind of framework in place, you can almost do anything with the hue. So let's say I want to change this color. If I drag this slider here, you'll see it's changing that hue value. And I can pretty easily get somewhere that doesn't look half bad just by randomly dragging this slider around. And that's all because these values are standardized. So with that little rule of thumb in mind, let's go ahead and build a cohesive brand palette. Now to start off, we really just need to find inspiration from somewhere. You might already have some colors saved in your swipe file, but if you don't, I've actually included a bunch of links here to help you get started. And I'm gonna use this inspiration page from my mind because I really like the palettes that they put together on this page. All right, I went ahead and grabbed this golden hour palette. Kind of reminds me of the Figma colors a little bit. And the first thing you'll notice is that the reason these colors look so good is that they follow that rule of thumb. Saturation is within 8 and the brightness is within 4. Now let's say I want to add on to this palette and find some kind of an accent color. Now you can go ahead and duplicate this color right here and start dragging around the hues like before. But what I recommend is heading over to color.adobe.com. And then you can simply paste in the hex code of the primary color, and they give you some color harmony rules over here that you can use to find other colors for your palette. Now I really like this lighter blue here in the complementary. So I'm going to go ahead and grab that and head back into Figma. Looks pretty good, right? But why does it look good? Well, if we look at the HSB values, what do we notice? 73 and 95. All that Adobe program is really doing is just standardizing the HSB values and providing a UI for you to discover different colors that sit within those rule of thumb confines that we outlined earlier. You could continue to plug in values and build as large of a color palette as you wanted. Now, I want to give a disclaimer before I go any further. This process is an excellent starting point and a really, really easy way to create cohesive palettes. But at the end of the day, you need to trust your eye more than the math. This is just a really great way to get yourself to a good place quickly. But we can't stop there. For almost every interface project, we need shades of our primary brand palette. Now, what I don't think is necessary is something like this, where you have 9, 10 plus shades for every single color. At the end of the day, this is overwhelming. And I know that variables provides a little bit of an answer to this by allowing you to define semantic colors. I still think this is overkill and it's going to be more headache than what it's worth for the vast majority of teams, unless you're building something like Polaris or Atlassian's design system that has to be massive. For most projects, all I need is a light variation and a dark variation. And the simplest way to create these is to keep the hue standardized across the colors. And all we're doing is manipulating the saturation and brightness values. Now, as a starting point for the light shades, what I like to do is just crank the brightness all the way up to 99. And then for the saturation, I'll typically fall somewhere in the 5 to 10 range. And you can kind of massage it from there. Because color palettes, especially in the early days, should be iterative. Once you're using them in your interface, you can kind of get a sense quickly of, is this working or is it not? And then you can come back and make a change later. I went ahead and standardized the red and the blue to both be 699, but you'll notice that I have the yellow as a little bit more saturated, and that's just because it's naturally a lighter color. Now, when I'm creating my dark shades, I typically leave the saturation values alone. So you'll see the 73 matches and the 81 matches and the 73 matches again. But what I'll do is I'll decrease the brightness all the way down to 50 as a starting point and then kind of massage it from there. And whenever possible, I like to derive colors from specific use cases. So a lot of times what I end up doing is writing dark text on top of a light background. And so I want to make sure that my dark colors all have a AAA contrast score when written on top of their light counterpart. So for something like the blue and the red, this is pretty easy. If I come in here and I'll run the contrast plugin, and you can see I'm at 8.74, and all I have to do is be above a 7. On the flip side though, if I was going to do that with yellow, you'll notice that at the 50 value, it's only a 5.22. And this is one of the reasons why yellow can be so frustrating to work with at times, because if I crank this down to 40, which is what would be required in order to have a AAA contrast rating, you start to get into poop land a little bit. And so at this point, you kind of have to ask yourself, do I want to optimize around legibility and text? Or do I think this is going to be more of like an accent color or borders or things like that? In which case, it would be totally fine to leave this at 50, and then you can preserve more of that yellow hue. And that's kind of a core way that I think about color in general. Whenever possible, we should have clear use cases in mind. That's going to ensure that we have a palette that's, one, effective to work with in UI design, but then also it's going to keep us from creating these massive palettes with never-ending shades. We're going to talk more about this idea of deriving colors from specific interface use cases in the next lesson. For now, hopefully this made color theory a little bit more practical in your mind.
That's so interesting that he went to color theory because this has nothing to do with using Figma, which makes me think that he believes a lot of designers have such a poor understanding of color that this lesson was necessary. And I think he's right because that was helpful for me. I actually don't know color very well, even though I've been designing for a while. So maybe we move on to the next lesson at this point. Easy mode. So if I show you what the Figma file looks like, it's basically what he was showing in the video. And if I had duplicated this, then I could have made the changes. I can try things out. He's got some pretty helpful comments here as well. So overall, it's like he's designed this extremely well. It's very well thought out. I can imagine many dozens of hours put into each lesson, even though they're only about 5 minutes each. So it's quite impressive. This has gone through many iterative stages. So let's go on to the next lesson, which would be the ultimate guide to, what's it called? Let me see. Go here. Gotta copy and paste it in because it's the wrong tab. The ultimate guide to a themable monocolor system. Okay, so another color lesson. Bring that back into this tab.
When you're designing interface,
So I know probably not a lot of people watching at this point, but if any questions or any requests, let me know. I know hasn't been smooth sailing so far, but we're gonna get there.
the vast majority of the color that you are using is some form of gray. And that's why it is essential to create a neutrals palette that sets you up for success. And now that you can use variables to do theming directly in Figma, it's never been more important. So in this video, I'm going to show you how to create a neutrals palette that is themable and derived directly from core interface use cases. Let's dive in. Now let's start by getting a quick preview of the end result. I like to create a neutrals palette inspired by Tailwind that goes from 50 to 950. So you have a total of 10 shades of gray. And then I also add on a white at the end as well. And this is going to ensure that you can easily cover all of the core interface use cases, even when you're designing a themable product, but you're not going to have too much overlap that could lead to confusion. Now, this entire process can be broken down into 3 steps. The first is we're going to nail the hue. Then we're going to decide on our saturation levels. And lastly, my favorite part, we're going to use UI to derive our brightness levels. So let's get started. My strategy for making sure that our grays look cohesive is I like to match the hue of my primary color. So in the brand palette lesson, I used this yellow here, and if I match this and use 41 for all of my hues, I'll get something like this. My demo files use a purple, which has a hue of 253, which will give me something closer to this. And if I don't want any hues at all in my neutrals palette, then I can decrease the saturation all the way down to 0, which is going to give me this look here. Once we match the hue of our primary color, the next step is to decide just how saturated do we want this palette? And the way to think about it is to look at the range of saturation. It's always going to behave the same way. Darker colors are going to be more saturated. Lighter colors are going to be less saturated, and they're probably going to approach 1 or 0. The decision you have to make is how wide do you want this range? In this top example, I'm only going from 10 to 1. And so the palette is pretty reserved. It's letting a little bit of that yellow in, but not too much. If I increase this range all the way to 50 and move my saturation down from there, see how much more pronounced this neutrals palette is? It's opinionated and it's really pulling in a lot of that primary color. Now, a nice middle ground is you'll probably have a range that spans 10, maybe 20 points, and that's gonna work for the vast majority of interfaces. Now, the last piece of the puzzle is also the most robust. So taking a step back, we've matched our hue, we've picked our saturation range, and the last step is to create our brightness values. And the way that I like to do that is by deriving them from some of the core interface use cases that we're gonna see in almost every product that we design. And when we're thinking about a themable system, the key is to no longer see things as dark and light. Instead, we think about it as high contrast and low contrast. And there's a great article right here if you're not familiar with how we think about contrast values. Once we do that, we can start to see things in pairs because colors at this end of the spectrum will be AAA in light mode, and colors at this end of the spectrum will be AAA in dark mode. So we kind of have to treat them the same way. Similarly, if we move in, something like a 600 will be a AA in light mode, and 400 will be a AA in dark mode. And so we can kind of think about these as interface pairs as well. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this mental model and we're going to apply it to some of the UI elements that we basically use.
That was really interesting. I kind of wish that he explained the math behind these two different levels, like why this would be AA. Like I can probably reverse engineer that, but if he just explained it, would have been really nice, really convenient. I would probably trust what he just said and just go off these guidelines to start off with, because maybe that's not really worth your time to look deeply into. But yeah, it's so interesting that he has articles as a link. So if you want to dive deeper into this area, you can do that. He's giving us the option to dive deeper if we want to, or just to kind of follow his guidelines and assume that this will be a good use of it 95 or 99% of the time. Who knows? So yeah, like it so far.
In every project, something like a AAA heading, or what happens when you hover over a border, or what do we use for page backgrounds? And the goal is to create color pairs that allow us to hit on all of these use cases in both light mode and dark mode. Now, the place that I always like to start is typography, because we have a few use cases that are always going to exist. The first is we're going to need some kind of a AAA heading. Now, from there, I am a big fan of having AA subtext to pair with this AAA heading. I think it looks really great. It allows us to have some contrast between these two pieces. And lastly, we know we're going to have to account for some disabled text as well, which requires at least a 3:1 ratio. And I'm just using the contrast app to get these values. So if I select this piece of text and run the contrast plugin, I'll get 5.56. I really just need this to be above 4.5, but I want to give myself a little bit of a margin for error just in case I'm not writing on a white background. Same thing over here. If I select this piece of text, you'll notice it is a 6.68, which is plenty of contrast, but it's going to create that nice visual separation with my headings. Lastly, I know that I'm going to need some disabled text, and I like to use 500 for both light mode and dark mode, and I need the contrast to be above a 3:1 in both use cases. And before I go any further, you're not going to nail these values on your very first try. There's going to be a lot of iterating and tweaking. We just want to get some initial structures in place that we can use. So don't feel like you have to obsess over these contrast values just yet, because we're going to take these colors and apply them to some different interface use cases as well. And inevitably, you're going to make some tweaks along the way. Next up, I like to jump to my backgrounds. And the way that I like to think about it is you typically need at least 3 different neutral shades that you can stack on top of each other with just a little bit of contrast. And this is going to be really useful in your interfaces. So if we zoom in, I've recreated that here, and then in dark mode over here. And these are almost always the first and the last 3 in your neutrals palette. So if we break it down here, we're using 950 to 800 in dark mode, and in light mode, we're using white to 100. Pretty simple stuff, but very important. Next up, we're gonna think about borders, and this is just gonna be moving inward 1 level. And it makes sense, right? Because whenever you're using these backgrounds, maybe you're putting a white card on like a really subtle gray background, you're often going to add a border to create just a bit more separation between those 2 shades. You can also think about the types of UI that you'll be creating. That's why I have these examples here. We know that we're going to have a subtle border that's used on inactive containers, things like generic cards. We know that we're also going to have a border for interactive elements like this button. And then we also know that when you hover over that button, we probably want the border to darken. So we're going to need at least one other contrast level like so. And so I've referred to these as base, subtle, and strong right here. And we're just using these 3 values for each. Remember that higher contrast background that we added in the previous slide? Well, that is almost always going to be the border for the middle contrast background. And if you make these 2 colors the same, it's going to be a lot easier to ensure you have the right contrast levels in your system and that all of your grays look cohesive. By this point, we've pretty much taken a stab at all of our colors, but a final box I like to check is thinking about our icons, because we're going to have a few use cases we want to hit. We know that we're going to have really high contrast icons. We also know we'll have some more subtle icons. And then lastly, we'll have lower contrast icons for things like inactive states or maybe a table row or something like that. If we use this pairs mental model, we know that the high contrast states will be at the end. I like to then make sure that I'm matching the mid contrast state with the same color that I'm using for the AA text, because a lot of times you're going to put those side by side. And so I want to make sure that for the middle contrast, I'm going to use 600 as well. As a general rule of thumb, for the low contrast, you can just flip those values. So I'm using 600 for mid contrast and then 400 in light mode, and I'm just going to swap those for dark mode. And that's going to give you a really nice starting point. If you follow these steps, you're going to end up with a neutrals palette that is flexible and cohesive, but I'm going to wrap up by reinforcing the fact that you're going to have to make tweaks. You're going to have to make iterations. And so when I was creating these values and ultimately coming up with these mental models, I was using a playground like this so that I could test out all of these use cases within context. I highly recommend doing something like this or using a couple screens from an existing app or product that you're working on just to make sure. Do you like how this feels? Do you need to darken this third shade a little bit? Are these icons popping enough? Trust your eyes over the math, but this model is going to make it really easy for you to spin up a system that works great.
Okay, that
Are these
was
icons popping enough?
interesting because the way he was describing it confused me at first, because I'm the type of crappy UI designer who mocks everything up. Like, I just wing it. And then if I want to turn it into a style guide or design system, I would, work backwards and see what's working, what's not working, and make the tweaks necessary so that where I'm hitting the accessibility guidelines, AAA for WCAG, and also making sure that things look good. So it's a constant like working backwards process. And the way he talked about in the beginning made me feel like he's building it from the individual atomic elements up first. Like he's deciding the style guide first before he builds anything. And I'm like, that was blowing my mind, because I'm like, okay, that is not how I approach UI design at all. And I wouldn't be able to do that very well. But it kind of makes sense, right? Because if you're building it up from the very ground up, then you wouldn't be making any mistakes or you wouldn't have these issues where you're not hitting the right contrast ratios or you're not getting the right color combination. You're just kind of trusting that everything falls into place. And I was like, that's too advanced for me. It's kind of like Salieri watching Mozart write out the music in Amadeus from the very beginning without even making any changes. So I was like, wow, that's awesome, but also unrealistic for somebody like my level. But then he talked about having these elements in place, not elements, but like mock-ups in place that you can see directly how your atomic elements and styles are changing the actual components, not in production, but like more complex components. And to me, that makes a lot more sense. So that's another way of approaching it. I don't work this way at all. I would need to kind of rethink how I work and maybe change my process to do it this way. But it makes sense. I think that makes a lot of sense. And I'm also realizing just like how stagnant my design skills are at this point, because I'm not totally understanding a lot of it. All right, so we're about halfway through the variable system, and it's interesting that the last 2 lessons, this one, the last one, didn't really touch on variables. I mean, it is, but not on the technical sense, which was what I was expecting. This is almost more on design, like UI design, as opposed to Figma technical skills. But I can see how this might eventually fold into variables. So I think our agreement was that we wouldn't show all the videos. So I'm just going to show the file, the Figma file for the next video so we can have an idea of where we're going. So now we're talking about how to create palettes. Huh. All right, I'm not going to show this video, but I can kind of see where he's going with this. And then I'm going to click on the next chapter, which is going to be 6 steps to establish a semantic color system. So again, not really on variables at all, on the technical side at least. But I can assume that all this will eventually come together magically at the end. And this is the last lesson. Which is the science behind a great typography system. Huh. All right, I'm going to watch part of this. Because I'm actually really interested in how all of this ties back in together. Maybe variables, like the hard part about variables isn't actually the technical aspects. Like you could probably pull up Figma, like Figma's help or community section, and like learn all the technical stuff. Like the real hard stuff is actually using it in a scalable or systematic way. And like you wouldn't be able to learn that from watching tutorials. You would need to work at a company with a very mature design process to see how they do it and the logic behind it, so that you can then build your own variables in your design system. And that's basically what he's showing you. So I would say that's valuable. Now, if I knew that this is how the best design teams at, say, Airbnb and Apple are doing it, like this is the epitome or the paradigm of using variables well, then I'd be a lot more confident. I kind of wish he maybe show a little bit more social proof so that I know this is how the best designers do it. But I have no reason to doubt him at this point that this isn't how good design teams work. So
having a typography system that designers love using is one of the most valuable parts of any Figma foundation. But it's still one of those things that can be a bit of a black box. So in this video, I'm gonna walk you through how I create a type system from scratch and start to identify some of the patterns and mental models that you can use in almost any product. Let's dive in. Let's start by getting a glimpse of what we're actually creating. At the end of the day, you're gonna have typography objects, and they're most likely gonna be responsive. So you'll have one for mobile, you'll have one for web, and depending on the size of your team and the maturity of the product, you might have one for tablet breakpoints as well. Now, in addition to having separate objects per breakpoint, I also typically find myself doing something like this, where I have an object for headings, an object for paragraph text, I might even have an object for caps case labels. And then lastly, I'll have an object for buttons. So in this walkthrough, we're gonna go ahead and create all of these. Now, before we get into the weeds on creating these typography elements, I wanna touch really quickly on how typography fits into the larger system that you're creating, because it's directly tied to the rest of your organization within Figma. For instance, in a very simple system, you might be able to have a single style guide that contains all of your styles and variables and all of your typography. This is going to work for a lot of smaller companies and products. But what often is going to happen is you might have a parent level primitives library, and then you're going to end up having product specific style guides. On the last product I worked at, that looked something like this, where we had a style guide for the web application that we called product, and then we had a separate style guide for the marketing site, which we called marketing. And then within that, we have the typography that maps to that style guide. So for the web application, this might be product typography. And then for the marketing site, we might have marketing typography. And this way, you can very easily import a single library for either the product or the marketing site, and everything that you need as a designer to build that part of the product is available in a single import. The high level takeaway is that I like to think about typography as being married to the relevant set of styles and variables so that you can import them as one library and have everything that you need to design whatever you're working on. Now that we have that out of the way, let's start creating our typography system. Now, the first step is going to be picking a type scale that we want to use to dictate the font sizes that we're working with. And if you're not familiar with a type scale, this is just how much bigger the concurrent piece of typography is. And I've included a link to a helpful website here that goes into further detail. You'll notice in these two screenshots how much bigger the H1 gets. And that's really what's happening when you're changing this type scale. If you use something like a 1.5, you're going to end up with this massive heading and maybe something you'd see on like an artsy agency site or something like that. Most of the time for marketing sites, I end up with something like a 1.33. If I'm designing something like a web app or a traditional product, I'll typically use 1.2x as my starting point, which is what is shown in this example. And the last thing I'll do typically is make sure to round my font size to the nearest 4 pixels, and that way I can avoid nasty decimals and make sure that everything fits nicely on my grid. Almost every time I'm going to think about my base unit as 16 pixels, which is standard, and I like to map that to my P2 and my H4 for products. And I'll show you why in a second. But first, now that we have our font sizes, it's time to set up our line heights. Now, the way that I calculate line heights is I'll take the font size times a multiplier. For headings, I typically use 120%, so 1.2x, and that will give me some kind of number.
All right, I'm going to stop here because I don't want to show the entire video as per our agreement with micro-rendering. I have a lot of feelings on this right now because, well, I want to be careful in how I phrase all this because I'm no longer a highly skilled UI designer at all. Like, I'm super stagnant at this point. And I no longer know a whole lot about design. Well, I never knew that much about design systems at all. So I'm a little bit confused at this point because we basically went through a few videos on the variables section of Figma, or Figma Academy 2.0, and I have a much better idea of what variables do, but mostly based on the first initial video that shows the power of variables. And the rest of the videos, to me, seem to be a combination of design system elements plus best practices in terms of making good design decisions in the UI side. So it's interesting in that, and again, this is not a fair assessment at all because I'm not a practicing designer at this point. So take this with a giant grain of salt. But when I went to Tommy Gioco's course last week, when he talked about making design decisions, I thought it would be materials like this. And I was excited about that. Like, how do I decide between what kind of fonts I should use? How do I decide what the differences between H1 and H2 text should be? And, and Rid is saying 120%. I'm like, okay, that's a great starting point. But why 120%? And I bet he's going to go into it soon. He probably has a link to it as well in the Figma file. But that's what I expected Tommy Gioco's course to talk about. And for some reason, Rid is talking about it instead. And what I expected from Rid's course was teach me how to use variables in a very technical sense. Like, show me all the limitations, all the capabilities from a technical perspective. And after I understand how to use variables inside and out, then show me the best practices so that I can think about how I would use it with more context. And instead, this is kind of reverse of that. Like, I'm not really seeing, like, I still don't know how to use variables really after watching this. But I have a pretty good idea of best practices. I mean, not to a level where I can defend or explain why it should be 120% or why we should use HSB really. I just know that this is how better designers do things, which is extremely valuable in itself. Like, would I watch this course? Yes. Would I pay $500 for it? Probably. Yeah, I think I would, because I assume that I would be able to learn a lot and it would save me 10 hours of time, and I would make more than $50 an hour. So this is a net positive for me. I would make back the money I spent on it just in terms of time. I couldn't say the same about Tommy's course, but then again, like I think I'm a much better decision maker on the design side than a designer on the UI side. So this course very much is for me right now. So that's not really a fair assessment. Tommy's course is just who I am as a designer. So if you're similar to me, like you work mostly in B2B, large corporations, and you have focused really hard on strategy, management, design leadership, research and stuff, and you need a primer to get you up to speed on using Figma and like getting really good at UI design, I think this is a great foundational course right now. It's just different than what I expected. So Dune says, what I could use is the one-on-one course that would allow me to quickly and efficiently wireframe and maybe mock up and prototype what's in my head. I suppose the value in these courses has to do with what you want to do. So yeah, I don't think this course is that either. I think this course is for somebody who is currently working in a company as a senior designer or lead designer, and or even a mid-level designer or even a junior designer. And they're just like, I spent way too much time trying to figure out how to use auto layout, how to use variables, and maybe my current design team isn't super design mature, and I don't really know how better design teams operate, so I'm gonna watch this course and learn about it, and I think that's super valuable. Now, ideally, what I would love is to find a designer who's working at like the most mature or most advanced design team possible, one where they've mastered everything that Figma has to offer. And I want to see how they operate and just kind of shadow them for a bit, and then like ask them questions like, oh, why did you use Figma this way? Why did you use variables this way? What's your decision making behind using 120% font differences? And if they can explain all that, then I would have gotten so much value out of that. Now, how much is that worth? Probably tens of thousands of dollars or more. And this is only $500. So I would say this is a great deal in that sense, but it's different than what I expected. And it's kind of the same issue with Tommy's course, where my expectations were not in line at all with what I saw. So yeah, again, not what I expected. Is this course good? Yes, I like it. It's definitely very well thought out. There's a lot of effort put into it. I'm learning a lot. I've learned quite a bit on how to, like, a little bit of color theory here, a little bit of accessibility here, a little bit of setting up design systems. Is it enough for me to operate immediately at a higher level? No, but it's planted a lot of really good ideas in my head, and it's kind of changed how I might approach UI design going forward. So I think that is in itself very valuable. But I don't think this is like an all-in-one course that can really jumpstart my career, which is kind of what I'm looking for right now. And maybe that's too big of an ask. So yeah, let me just kind of bring us back to the Figma file so you can see like the chapter layout. So the first module is on variable system. We went through the first 3 videos, and then I jumped directly to the last video. And the first video, getting started with the variables, showing us like the capabilities of light and dark mode, I was like, wow, that's pretty cool. Like that would have saved me some time using variables. I kind of wish that we dove deeper into how to do that on a technical side. I mean, we kind of did, but it was more just like, let me show you, let me wow you with the capabilities. I kind of want to do a little bit slower so I can see exactly which buttons to press, but not a big complaint because you can obviously slow down the video to really watch what's happening. But we never really went back to the technical side. We've just been talking about how to set up design system elements. And my other question is, there are so much material out there made by Molly Helmut and Dan Mall on design systems, and I assume they're covering, again, this is my assumption, right? I'm assuming they're covering this kind of material. Like this is what I would expect from Molly or Dan from their courses, not from Figma Academy 2.0. So that's interesting. Not a complaint really, but just setting out the differences. Core component, 7 ways to create an icon library designers love using. Advanced components, design workflows, advanced prototyping. So I feel like all this stuff, like the first 3 modules, these are all design system stuff. And that's all right. I would assume if you get really good at Figma, you probably start to do more design system stuff to begin with. That makes sense. And that's supposed to kind of speed up your workflow in a way. So design workflows is kind of like where it gets really interesting for me, because you're talking about how to deal with real data in Figma, how to iterate like a pro, making bulk changes multi-edit. So that's great. That's what I was expecting from this course. Advanced prototyping with variables. Okay, so now maybe this is where we should be. This is my expectations when I was talking about variables. So let me pick a random video from here and just kind of like go into it. This could be interesting. Let me just bring this right back. Let's watch this video. I think this could show us some stuff.
I love Monday.com.
What's Monday?
Why am I watching ads in a video course that I paid $500 for? What the fuck? But anyway, Monday. At least it's not a Joe Rogan course where I have to see Candace Owens' mug. Very exciting. Monday.com. I get free advertisement. So Dune says, I want something like this that allows me to take mocks into Figma for further editing as opposed to remaking them. Galaxy.ai, AI sketch to image. Okay, well, I don't think this course will help you do that, unfortunately. Skip, finally. Finally.
Are you ready for a little bit of Figma magic? If you look
Yes.
here, this is the Maven homepage. So there are a ton of different course cards, titles, descriptions, ratings, images. And if I was going to update all of these manually, it would take me forever. But not anymore, because there is a plugin that I'm so excited about called Kernel, and I'm going to show you how it works really quickly. So I'm going to select my grid, and I'm going to use the Select Layers plugin. I'm going to type in the name of my component, which is the course card, hit enter, and now I have everything selected in the layer list, and all I have to do is come in here, run kernel. I've already pointed it at the Maven database. I can hit apply all, and just like that, it's magic. It will actually cycle through all of the real Maven data and apply everything, so I can see all of the nasty edge cases with no images and different length of titles and ratings and everything automatically. You can actually design with real data using kernel. Let's dive in.
Okay, that's interesting. That's cool. I feel like I'm assuming there's a database somewhere for this, probably in Airtable or Monday or Notion or an Excel spreadsheet or maybe an actual database. That's cool, but I also feel like we're blurring the lines of why don't I just learn how to code stuff and build it that way instead of going to Figma and then using all these plugins for this. Yeah, I think we're at that point.
Kernel's vision is to make it so that we can design with real data more easily directly inside of Figma. And before I go any further, this isn't a sponsored post. They didn't ask me to do this. I'm just really excited about not only this product, but the entire space. As designers, we're going to start getting closer and closer to code and real data. And with the advancements in AI, it feels like this space is just heating up. So in this video, I'm going to show you a little bit about how kernel works. We're going to set up some configurations, and then we can actually see what it's like to design with data directly inside of Figma. When you open up the kernel plugin, the first thing you're going to see is this window. Now, they do a good job of helping you get started. You don't have to start from a blank slate. They have a content generator, which makes it really easy to just use better dummy data. But the real magic is when you start to create new libraries, and you can import your data however you'd like. For me, I actually connected directly to the.
Do any of you remember Craft from Sketch or the Envision DSM? Because this was all they promised like a decade ago. And it worked. I mean, it was great when it worked, but it almost never worked because Envision did not make good products, to say the least. So, yeah, this is great. It just feels like it's so late at this point.
JSON that we use at Maven. Super, super simple. If you don't know how it works, just ping an engineer and they can give you a JSON file in 20 seconds. And that way you have access to your full data set. Once you do that, your library is available right here. So if I click into Maven, for instance, I can see the full data set that we have available, and I can start injecting that directly into my component.
Just Google JSON and learn how to write JSON. Like, it's not that. If you need an engineer to explain JSON to you, then you got bigger issues as a designer working in tech.
Components. For this example, I'm going to use the Spotify data because that's something that if you open up kernel right now, you already have, and that way you can follow along. So if you click in here, you'll see they've given us album, artist, and track data that we can really quickly use. And if you install the plugin from the Figma community, there's a nice walkthrough file that will help you get started with some of the basics. Now, I actually made a full Spotify mockup here that we can use to play around, including some of their more common components and then some different layouts right here. So the first thing I'm going to walk you through is how to set up a new configuration, which is the word that kernel uses for attaching data directly to components. So if I go in here and select an instance of a component, and I open up kernel, you'll see this nice CTA to create a new configuration that is attached to the selected component. Pretty neat, huh? So if I click this, this is going to open up the layer list for the selected component. And then on the right here, it's going to show me all of the data that I can map that to. So I have 3 different layers that I can attach data to. So if I select the artist, I can come here, get the artist name, and as soon as you see the check mark, that means it's attached. So then I can move into the title. Let's get the album name, boom. And then the last piece is, let's select the cover, and if I scroll down here, it'll show me that I can map it to the album image like so. All I have to do is create configuration, hit save, and I am ready to use it. Pretty simple, right? So then all I have to do is come here, hit enter, select all of my instances. And if I run the kernel plugin, it's automatically going to know that this component maps to the configuration that I just made. And if you want to double check, you can hit this menu button and it'll show you the configuration that is selected. So all I have to do is hit apply all, and just like that, I'm able to populate these components with a bunch of real data. And the reason this is important is, like you see here, it forces these decisions around truncation and resizing. And so right away, I can tell, okay, well, this is not what I want it to look like. And so I can come into the component over here. I already have it set to fill container. So all I have to do is hit type settings and change it to truncate on resizing. And now my component is fixed and it matches the actual Spotify UI. Really quickly, let's do the same thing for the artist component. I can hit this button up here, view configurations. You can see I don't yet have a configuration made for this component. And the difference here is for the label text, this always stays artist. So I don't want to touch that. I'll just come to the artist, map that to the name, map this to the artist image instead of the album image, create configuration, and I am ready to run this. You'll see it selected the artist card. I can hit apply, and I have totally dynamic data with Sam Smith leading the charge. Hopefully you can see how powerful a tool like this is. One, it's going to save you a heck of a lot of time. There's a reason that one of Kernel's core value propositions is to design 10 times faster, but also it's going to shine a light on all of those weird edge cases that we have to consider as designers so that we can make sure that the way that our components are responding, the way that we're handling awkward lengths of text, different broken images, it's going to force us to figure all of that stuff out.
I want to talk about this for a second because I feel like there are certain assumptions being made here that I don't fully agree with. And that's around this idea that we need to create super high fidelity prototypes that take care of all edge cases. And I don't think we typically do that as designers for good reason. Like if we're making prototypes, we usually are doing it for a few reasons. One, to do handoffs at some point or to communicate our vision to developers. And the other one is to test for certain challenges or to answer certain questions we might have on the product side or on the design side, wherever it might be. And the prototype's fidelity also only needs to be as high as needed to test for an assumption or for a question you have, right? And it does not need to be absolutely like pixel perfect. You're not trying to see if the end user can identify any mistakes you are making on a pixel level, right? You're trying to figure out, are they able to navigate this flow, for example? Do they understand where to go next? Do they understand, are they like, gelling with a CTA? Do they understand the data that's being presented to them? And a lot of these times, the prototypes that you're building for it doesn't take up that much time. And in fact, the amount of time you spend setting up kernel or other tools or like Craft or DSM to get to that kind of high fidelity quality and also to create a system where you can do a lot of testing, then yeah, I would say kernel is cool, it's useful. Does it save me a lot of time yet? Probably not, unless I set up the system first. And I feel questionable about whether or not it would be worth it, because it's one of those cases where you set up something that's like super great, that's super cool, but the actual use case for it, the actual value it delivers for you on the design team is minuscule, and you've actually wasted more time setting it up. And I worry, is kernel one of those examples? Again, very cool, but in most cases, you do not need super high fidelity prototypes. Like figuring out, what if you get images that are broken or text that are too long? Do you really, really need to set up kernel to know what that's going to look like? I feel like most senior designers who've been around long enough kind of know, okay, you have space for this many characters. Let me look at the data. Okay, well, there are, 2% of the data has that issue. How do we solve for it? Okay, this is how we truncate the text. Next, let's move on to the next thing, right? You kind of can design for it ahead of time without having to plug everything in to realize, okay, it looks this way. Like as designers, most of the time we're able to visualize that. Were you able to view the full list of lessons prior to purchasing? I'm not sure. I didn't do it actually. Like I kind of bought it on the marketing of it all. Like it's been said by many designers that Figma Academy 2.0 is like one of the most or the best events Figma courses out there, and it's kind of held up as an example of a content creator who's able to create high quality and lucrative courses. So among the design Slack channel, like with Tommy and Trevor and all these other folks that I used to be in, that's kind of what we talked about. Like, okay, if we were to make design courses, what are some good ones that we can kind of follow and look at as examples? And Rids was one of them. Like, it's definitely up there. I would say this is one of the highest quality courses I've seen so far. And I do think it's valuable. It's just how some parts of it, I'm like, how realistic is it to actually implement it this way? And if kernel is so useful, why aren't more design teams using it? Or maybe they are. I don't know. See, I haven't worked in a design team for a while now. I checked kernel's page. It's free for personal use, $12 per month for personal. If you want to get more data sets or more mappings and teams, $99 per month. So it's not that expensive actually compared to Envision DSM. But again, very cool. Would I need it? I'm skeptical. I feel like it would save me some time if I were to scout it up, but just setting it up and scaling it, it's gonna take many hours probably.
Out. I'm so excited to live in a world where design and engineering are both pulling from the same data source as a way to keep everyone in sync and save a bunch of time. I'll drop a link to Kernel in the comments, so definitely head over there and start playing with it today. They're a young team, but I'm so excited about everything that they're building, and this is definitely a space to watch.
I hate ads, and I hate that Google Chrome got rid of the ad blocker plugins because I was definitely relying on that. But anyway, what he's saying about like developers and designers pulling from the same data source, yeah, I think that's great. I do see as an opportunity cost as well. Like if I were to really get into this course, it would probably take me um, probably like a dozen hours at least. And I do wonder if I should be investing all this time and energy into learning front end development instead, so that I can actually pull in data sources and build as opposed to trying to pseudo build in Figma because it seems like a stopgap measure. And maybe it is. Maybe this is perfectly fine. It's like it'll take you like an hour to learn how to use kernel, and it will take you many more hours to actually learn how to pull in real data. But I feel like one is more scalable than the other. And if Grid is right in that we're all going to be builders in the future, then why learn a pseudo way of doing things like a stopgap measure versus learn to do the real thing? Now, assuming that AI doesn't take over all the front end development stuff. But anyway, I'm kind of done for the day today. We're at more than an hour. I hope you found some value in this to help you make up your decision around whether or not this course is for you. Again, we're probably different designers, but based on my own background and my own experience, would I spend $500 on this course? Yes, I would. I think it would be valuable just to watch the videos so I have a better idea of how other designers approach how they build design systems. My main complaints are, well, my main complaint is that this is different from my expectation going into it. I assumed there would be more technical stuff teaching me how to use actual tools like Figma really well, and less so on how to construct design systems, which again is valuable. I'm learning stuff, but if I already knew this stuff, like if I build design systems for real, and I have a better understanding of UI design and elements of color theory and accessibility, then I don't know if this would be worth it for me. But since I don't, I think, yeah, it is worth it for me. The other thing is everything here available for you if you didn't want to pay any money, like $500? If you didn't have the money, you can probably find all the resources for free. You can collaborate it together. You can like learn color theory, learn how to use color.adobe.com. You can probably find kernel on your own and use kernel's help files to teach you this. But it would take up time. And I would say my time is valuable enough that paying the $500 would be worth it for me, so I don't have to clobber all this together. So that's another reason why I think it's worth it. And says I could see this portion of the course better categorized within a bonus section that covers plugins and other tips. Yeah, the kernel video felt a little bit more like an ad almost. I was like, hey, do you get sponsored by kernel? But he mentioned that he wasn't sponsored, so that's cool. I mean, he really believes in it, so that's great. I have no reason to doubt him. I felt some low-grade anxiety looking at a long list of lessons, to be honest. Makes me feel like I need to become an expert in order to become mediocre in my aspirations. I actually don't think the courses are that bad. I feel like I can knock out half of this within a day. And I can probably do this within like 2 days if I put my mind to it. So I don't think this, I mean, to me, it doesn't feel overwhelming. I've seen more overwhelming stuff. Like if you want to look into, what's that course called Odin. Like if you want to learn how to code, do the Odin course. That gave me anxiety looking at all the stuff I would have to do to be like a somewhat half-assed front-end developer or full-stack developer. So yeah, not that bad in my opinion, but again, different from my expectations. No, it's still good. It's just different. And I kind of wish that all the different design system content creators and course creators delineated what they offered and what they didn't offer so that you know who to pull from, because I feel like there could be some overlaps between this and Molly Helmut's courses and also Dan Mall's courses. Now, what I've seen from Dan Mall's courses is more on like the politics or how to get people to buy into a design system, how to stand it up, which is more of a high level advanced soft skills kind of stuff, which to me is also extremely valuable. But it's just so interesting that every single course I've gone into, it's completely broken my expectations. Now, do I still find value in them? Yes, but not what I expected. And maybe that's a good thing, because you don't know what you don't know. Anyway, thank you everyone for tuning in, watching most of this, and dealing with all the technical difficulties. I'll get better at it down the line. If you have any recommendations, any suggestions of other courses I should look into it, happy to. I can also maybe dive back into either Tommy's course or Figma Academy 2.0 next week as well. If anyone's interested, or if there's another course you would like, let me know. If you have any recommendations how I can improve this process, improve the tech side of things, because I'm kind of like bumbling around a bit, let me know. I'm always up for harsh criticisms. And yeah, thanks again. I hope you all have a wonderful day and take care.